Start the recording. Now you have the floor.
All right, we're good?
Yeah.
Cool. Hello, everyone. My name is Carlos Rebollar, and today I'll be showing you a project that I've been working on with my faculty mentor, Dr. Erin Hennes, and an NYU graduate student, Katie Mason, as part of the SPUR project. So the impact of climate change is devastating. Not only is it increasing the prevalence of extreme weather events, but it's also having a lesser emphasized impact on our economy. Experts agree that implementing climate policies that combat climate change is important for the well-being of our planet and economy. But climate policies struggle to garner support because they are framed and perceived as threatening. Here's one example from former President Donald Trump, where he says that implementing the Green New Deal is going to permanently eliminate all planes, cows, cars, oil, gas, and the military. And though this is just one anecdote, climate change rhetoric often focuses on the socioeconomic cost of addressing climate change. But garnering support for climate policy is also made difficult because implementing policies implies change. This is a problem because research on system justification theory finds that people have a tendency to bolster, justify, and defend current social, economic, and political states of affairs. Importantly, for this project, system justification is associated with a higher denial of environmental issues. This makes sense because believing in human-caused climate change suggests that there is something wrong with our current high-emissions economy and that we must change how things are run. Therefore, high economic system justifiers may deny environmental concern because they feel more threatened by the implementation of climate policies than the threats of climate change itself. So the first study in the current project sought to explore how low and high system justifiers perceive the threat posed by climate change and climate policy. This study was conducted and analyzed prior to me joining the project, so I'll try to move through it quickly to get to my contributions. So our team recruited 800 participants on an online platform called MTurk and completed several measures, but for the sake of time, I've only included measures relevant to the results that I'm going to present. So participants completed a 17-item measure of economic system justification, which measures people's tendency to justify economic inequality and defend the status quo. As our outcome variables, we asked all participants to report how threatening they found climate change and climate policy to be to the status quo. We asked them also to report how concerned they were about climate change. We predicted that low economic system justifiers would see climate change as more threatening than climate policy, but that those who were high in economic system justification would see climate policy as more threatening than climate change. So this graph, we show economic system justification as the predictor on the x-axis and perceptions of climate change or climate policy as threatening on the y-axis. So as we can see on the left side of the graph, our predictions were supported. Low system justifiers saw climate change as a significantly greater threat to the status quo than climate policy. And that's great because that likely indicates greater pro-environmental attitudes. But on the right side, those high in economic system justification saw climate policy as more threatening than climate change. This, we believe, is a problem because it suggests that high system justifiers might be engaging in solution aversion, which is when people deny that a problem exists because they disagree about what the solution is. So in this case, greater relative perceptions of policy as threatening might explain why high system justifiers deny concern for climate change. This knowledge is useful, though, because it suggests a couple of paths for intervention among high system justifiers. So either we can attempt to lower their perception of climate policy as a threat, or, as we'll try to do in study 2, it could increase the perception of climate change as threatening. The point is that we want to make climate change seem relatively more threatening than climate policy. But before getting to that, we wanted to explore the independent contributions of climate policy and climate change threat perceptions on actual environmental attitudes. So we ran a parallel mediation using economic system justification as our predictor, climate change concern as our outcome, and perceptions of policy threat and climate change as a threat as our mediators. And we found that climate change threat perceptions explain the relationship between system justification and climate change concern. But importantly, so do climate policy threat perceptions. So what this means is that though environmental efforts seem to focus on increasing the perception of climate change as threatening, this is only half the battle. Perceptions of policy as threatening are important for environmental attitudes, and we might benefit from attempting to alleviate the perceived threat of climate policies. But this study is limited by its correlational design, and our mediation should be interpreted with caution since we have not actually shown causal effects just yet. So in study 2, we're attempting to demonstrate the causal effect of threat perceptions on environmental concern of high system justifiers by framing climate change or climate policy as a threat to the status quo. We hope that by increasing climate change threat perceptions, high system justifiers will express a greater concern for climate change. So this study is where I've made my contributions as part of the SPUR program. Our team of researchers thought that we might harness people's aversion to change by framing climate change itself as a threat to the socioeconomic status quo. By emphasizing the threatening nature of climate change, particularly its economic costs, we might get high system justifiers to report greater concern for climate change. So over the past few months, I've been working with Katie Mason and Dr. Hennes to develop the materials for this study, and will eventually help in analyzing and interpreting the data once that has been collected. I'm going to walk you guys through the proposed methods, the materials that I've been helping create, and some expected results. So we're still waiting on a power analysis to figure out exactly how many participants we need to collect, but we are aiming to only collect conservative participants or self-identifying Republicans, because that has been shown to be positively associated with system justification. So each participant will be randomly assigned to read a tweet thread talking about the threat that either climate policy, climate change, or cell phones poses to the socioeconomic status quo. Finally, we will measure concern for climate change as a main outcome variable. Several other outcome variables related to environmental belief and action will also be measured, but since we expect the same pattern of results for all of these DVs, I will not mention them specifically. So to get an idea of what participants will see, here's the beginning of the tweet threads in our 2 key experimental conditions. So in the condition on the left, climate change is framed as a threat to the US economy, while on the right, climate policy is framed as a threat to the US economy. We have attempted to match the language in both conditions as much as possible so that the only difference between them is whether climate change or policy is framed as a threat. So as an example, in the climate change condition, we highlighted the costs of major weather catastrophes, while in the climate policy condition on the right, we highlighted the high costs of climate research. And in both conditions, the fact that these expenses are paid for by average American taxpayers is emphasized. So here we have some bar graphs of our expected results. So the conditions are clustered on the x-axis, with each color representing a different outcome variable. So blue bars indicate perceptions of climate change as threatening, and orange bars are perceptions of climate policy as threatening. In the climate change as threat condition, we expect that climate change will be perceived as significantly more threatening than climate policy. But within the climate policy as threat condition, we expect that climate policy will be seen as significantly more threatening than climate change. Regarding our main outcome variable, we expect to see that participants in the climate change as threat condition will report significantly greater climate concern than those in the climate policy as threat and cell phone as threat condition. We also expect to see this pattern for other DVs, including support for interventionist policies and pro-environmental behavioral intentions. So again, the reason that we expect participants in the climate change as threat condition to have more pro-environmental attitudes than those in the climate policy as threat condition is because we are changing participants' perception of climate change as a threat relative to their perception of climate policy as a threat. So whether someone sees either climate change or climate policy as threatening does not matter as much on our outcomes as the difference between the two. So we expect that the more people see climate change as a greater threat than climate policy, the more they will be concerned about climate change and support for interventionist policies. So in sum, we hope to show that by emphasizing the threat climate change poses to the socioeconomic status quo, we can increase concern for climate change and support for environmental policies. This is especially important for high system justifiers who have historically demonstrated less concern for climate change and support for environmental action. We also hope to show that this difference will be explained by the relative difference in threat perceptions of climate change and climate policy. And if we find support for this idea, then it suggests that we might further increase concern for climate change by alleviating the perceived threat of climate policy among high system justifiers. So we will attempt to demonstrate this idea in study 2 by exploring whether emphasizing climate policy as a solution to the threat of climate change will have a more positive effect on climate concern than just framing climate change as a threat. So I'd like to thank my faculty mentor, Dr. Erin Hennes, and Katie Mason, who is leading this project, for all of their support, and thank Dr. Michael Krause for directing this program. Can I take any questions?